everybody. Welcome to another episode of Jimmy Wolf Talks or JW Talks. Today we have a fun topic. It's I would call it the post hair metal band movement of the latter part of the 80s. And I picked the year 1989 because this was the year where four really big hair metal bands had their debut records. We have Warrant with Dirty, Rotten, Filthy, Stinkin' Rich. We have Skid Row with their self-titled album Skid Row. We got Extreme with their self-titled album Extreme. Oh, there's Skid Row, yep. And we got Mr. Big with their self-titled debut Mr. Big. So what I've just known of these four bands, Skid Row definitely had the most successful album of the four. All of their major hits were on this record. The other three bands would have more success on their sophomore records. But I think that all these four records are really well done. The positive thing about this late era of hair metal was that they had a lot of time to get ready. They had a lot of influences from the first wave of hair metal bands like Motley Crue and Rat and
Guns N' Roses.
Yeah, I'd say Guns N' Roses is kind of a mid. They're kind of in the middle. But yeah, like Guns N' Roses. And again, like hair metal. I mean, that sounds like a bit of a derogatory term for this to this music, but you know, it's kind of fun. All these bands did have a lot of hair, and they were.
If the shoe fits.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, or you could say pop metal, right? It's like commercial metal. Where they all had a lot of hit songs. They were radio friendly. So yeah, pop metal, hair metal, or just rock and roll. I mean, that's fine too, right? Just like 80s rock works as well. So yeah, I thought it'd be fun to rank these four records. I found this very difficult because I like all four albums. I think all four of them are great. I mean, going pound for pound, Skid Row was by far the most successful album of these four. Warrant would be the second most popular. I think it sold 2 million. Extreme and Mr. Big hardly sold anything. I think Mr. Big only sold like 100 or 200,000, and most of it was Japan. Extreme, I think, only sold 300,000. But the bands definitely were getting a buzz, and the label believed in them because they gave them another chance. And so yeah, let's. One other common thread of these four bands is that they had their most success with the power ballad, right? The power ballad was big in the late 80s, right? You had to have a power ballad on your record.
Big first single.
Yeah. Extreme's biggest song was just acoustic guitar and voice, right? More than words was huge. Mr. Big, same thing. They had To Be With You was a stripped down acoustic jam, right? Yeah, I'd say Warrant probably doesn't quite fit in that because their biggest song is probably Cherry Pie, which was a rocker. But Mr. Big, yeah. Who else? Yeah, I mean, Skid Row had Remember You, right? So that was their power ballad. Yeah, so let's get into this. Do you want to just start with your ranking, Jeff? And then I'll go second.
So to start this off, Jimmy, like you, I grew up in this era. I was a young lad during these days.
Nice.
I didn't actually really like this kind of music when these albums were current. I liked rap music. I liked Tone Loc and Young MC, and so although I do remember all of them, I didn't particularly. I particularly dig it, but also this was also the time when I didn't really have a musical palette yet. I mean, I liked what my dad liked. I liked the odd song on the radio, but I didn't have a taste or anything, with the exception of rap, which was new and it was hip and the young kids liked it. I didn't have a taste or a real musical palette yet. And now that I'm older, I can approach these albums and And I feel like I can be reasonably fair in my ranking and assessment. Um, However, that being said, uh, each one of these albums to me reminds me of another band. I have, and it, in order to fairly assess an album, it's not good to start out with a comparison to another band. But I can't help myself because you had your big '80s bands already. You had you had there were big power bands in the '80s that sold tons of records, and I think that's what these bands all wanted. They wanted that level of success and uh, to a certain extent acclaim as well, or critical acclaim. I don't know how critically acclaimed Motley Crue was in the '80s because I didn't read the press. I didn't read record reviews or anything. All I can remember is from growing up and hearing their songs on the radio, and they got an awful lot of radio play. But anyways, so I'm gonna start. I'm gonna start from the bottom. Um, the most flagrant. I don't want to use the word copy, but the most flagrant, flagrant band that I feel is following a formula would definitely be Warrant. Um, Now, this debut album sounds good. Like the production is big. It sounds, it sounds big and lush. Big guitar, big vocal. Uh, but again, they really follow the formula really well. They got the good looking lead singer with the big voice. They've got the very talented guitar player, and the competent rhythm section in the background. Low key, but definitely delivering the goods. Um, just in terms, and also, I'm also going to say this. This album cover for Dirty, Rotten, Filthy, Stinkin' Rich, I've always hated. Um, Now it's very memorable, and I remember seeing it in the record store. But that big fat like pig man on the front of the bill,
Yeah.
I found to be a little vulgar. Even as a child, I didn't like it, and in that regard, I'm somewhat prejudiced. But I mean, also, a record cover is supposed to help sell the record too. And this is a choice that they made that I do not agree with and I didn't like. And I still don't like it to this day. So, um, Heaven is a good song. I'll say that. But I just feel like the rest of the record is very, very Motley Crue. Uh,
Yeah.
Even to the album title is called Dirty, Rotten, Filthy, Stinkin' Rich. And I just feel like they are the kind of band that wanted, just like, I can understand the fact that the Crue, they craved celebrity and fame and they used rock and roll as an outlet to get them there. But Warrant was like, well, they did it. Let's do it ourselves. Why not? You can sing, you can play guitar, and you're pretty decent on that kit. Let's do it. And I just found it a bit of the songs were a lot of the songs were about pussy and money and fame and all the things the Crue talk about, except the Crue, I feel, did it better and were more. I don't want to use the word talented because these guys were talented. Jamie Lynn, I believe, was his name, the singer.
Jenny Lane.
Jane Lane. Yeah.
Yeah, Janie
Big
Lane.
voice, great singer. And I'm not going to argue the fact that these guys aren't talented. They definitely were. These guys brought the record label just didn't pick a couple Joes off the street and be like, look, we want you to copy Girls, Girls, Girls. These guys were seasoned musicians. They could all play. It just seems to me that it really was the formula of, the late '80s hair metal formula, and Warrant's debut really, really just, to me, honestly, nothing stood out with the exception of Heaven, which was a big power ballad, but also if I'm going to be critical here, it was schmaltzy and you know, um, to me it just sounds like a poor man's. If you go to any of the great records from the '80s, you're going to get better representations of rock music. And I also have to say though that perhaps if I was an adult in the '80s and I was into this scene, probably Warrant's debut would have done it for me because it is good. You know, the riffs are big, you know, and they deliver the goods. It's not my cup of tea because out of that scene, unfortunately, because I I'm coming back to it now later in life. I'm only going to cherry pick. I'm only going to cherry pie pick the big hits, right? Like the best albums, because to me the best albums of that genre are timeless. So you know, there's a handful of them in there, and Warrant doesn't even it isn't even on my radar. So Warrant's debut, definitely low man on the totem pole here for me. Um, Number three would be Mr. Big. Now, I have to say, I was actually pleasantly surprised when I listened to this album. It's pretty good. Um, the subject matter was not derivative. It was, or it wasn't. It wasn't banal or just carbon copy of what they weren't just talking about pussy and money.
Yeah.
So in that regard, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed this album. I'll have to say I listened to it once front to back, and it was enjoyable. That being said, am I going to go buy it? No, nothing screamed to me to be like, this is a band I want to go explore further. But I was, like I said, pleasantly surprised because the only thing I know from Mr. Big was the big one, which was "To Be With You," which is a lovely song. I mean, I can remember slow dancing with the girl to that song in grade 8 graduation. So that one's a bit special to me. But good. I probably would have loved it had I been older in those days. But now that I'm an adult, nothing really screams out to me about that record. I don't really feel, Mr. Big isn't going to become. I'm not going to go raid their back catalog and go try to learn more about them. Number three, Extreme. Pleasantly surprised again. Eddie Sharon is a very good singer. Although I must say, although it was the style of the day, there's something in the production that, or whether it's the songs, how they were written, the key or whatever, it didn't really showcase Eddie.
I'd be Gary. Gary
Sharon, yeah, it didn't really showcase his vocal prowess to the extent that the later records do, or certainly the More Than Words, because that man can really sing, and his vocals were a little too like maybe mid range. They didn't soar as much as in some of the even the song from the second record about "Get the Fuck Out" or something like that, or again big huge vocal. And I appreciate that more. If I'm going to be highly critical too, there's a little interlude there that is very Eruption-esque.
Oh yeah.
Right in the middle of that record there.
That's Eruption.
Again, if I'm going to be critical, I find them riding the Sammy Hagar era Van Halen coattails a little bit. But again, I was pleasantly surprised. Phenomenal guitar playing, good vocals, not great vocals, but good. Although I know Gary Sharon to be a great singer, I don't feel this record really represented his vocals that great. And whether it was the producer or just the way the songs were written, I can't really tell. That's your domain, Jimmy, being the producer extraordinaire. So yeah, Extreme. But again, I was pleasantly surprised. This is a band I knew nothing about except for More Than Words and Get the Funk Out. And again, this sounds like a real late '80s. Again, had I been into this scene, I probably would have loved this record for sure. Uh, these guys came on the scene, and I have to say, although I do feel that they're definitely they're they're definitely huge Van Halen fans.
Yeah.
Um, I don't really. I feel like it's less derivative than Warrant. I really. The more when I listened to that album, all I thought was Motley Crue, All Night Long. So at least Extreme kind of they established themselves as their own group. And the sad thing is in this scene too, after Warrant came out, there was a whole other slew of third generation bands, which were carbon copies of Warrant, like Striper and the Bullet Boys, and and these bands sucked. But again, all great singers, um, great guitar players, good rhythm section. Big power ballad to start, big rocker for the second single, and if they gathered enough steam, there might be a third single. But anyway, I honestly feel like Warrant was the start of the real of the formulaic late '80s rock scene. So that only leaves one Skid Row for number one.
Nice.
Skid Row certainly established themselves as an entity unto themselves. Sebastian Bach, by far the best singer out of all these guys. Sebastian Bach, I don't want to get too big for my britches here, but like we're talking Axl Rose quality vocals here. This man can belt it out, and I remember you. What an incredible vocal performance. Definitely the power ballad out of that decade that I'm going to remember most. I got to say, too, that for this album, though, definitely the record label, I mean, they really knew. They definitely chose the choicest goods off the record to put out as singles. And for sure, I Will Remember You, Youth Gone Wild, and 18 in Life are the best songs. But there's some pretty other Big Guns is pretty good. Can't Stand the Heartache. I like Piece of Me. I liked. Rattlesnake Shake sounds a little too much. It's borrowing a little heavy. I got a rattlesnake suitcase under my arm. It's a little too Guns N' Roses. But certainly the label knew they found something special with Skid Row, and I definitely can understand why it was the biggest seller. Great guitar playing too. I'm not sure if the guitar player is necessarily better than the guitar playing in the other albums, but very, very strong. And definitely, since I Will Remember You is by far the best song off of any of those four records. Definitely, my verdict is for Skid Row all the way. And if I actually had to rate these albums out of 10, my personal ratings would be for Warrant. I would have to give it a 5 out of 10, just because of the banal songwriting. To me, it's supposed to be maybe a bit satirical, but it just comes off as a bit crass to me. Mr. Big, I would give it a 6.5. It is a satisfactory debut. Extreme, I would give 7. I would give it one notch up. And Skid Row's debut, I would give it a 7.5 because it's no Appetite for Destruction, but it is better than Girls, 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 and
there you go.
It's worth owning for me.
Cool.
And I gotta say, I hate to keep bringing it back to the singles, but I mean, I Will Remember You is a timeless, beautiful ballad that I remember then. I love still to this day. And there you go, 7.5 Skid Row.
Cool. No, yeah, no, it's
What say you, Jimmy?
okay. Well, we got mine's a little different, but we got one that lined up, and that's my number 4. I'm going to go with Warrant as well. Yeah, I agree with you that Warrant. I would say the equivalent band that was kind of like almost made this kind of like 80s metal a little too cheesy, if that's the best word to use, is Poison. It was kind of another band. Like, I mean, I like Poison as well, but it's almost like it's getting too much into the genre. Like they're too hair metal. It's too much, right? Um, for me, Cherry Pie is what did it for Warrant. It's I mean, the video for Cherry Pie is, I like it because it's got Bobby Brown, who I think is gorgeous. Had a huge crush on her.
I will never forget seeing that video for the first time. She was the hottest woman I had ever seen in my life.
Yeah, yeah. She married the singer for Warrant. Yeah. But yeah, like for me, uh, although I do like this Warrant like album, I think it's a good album. Uh, I like all the singles: Down Boys, Heaven, Big Talk, Sometimes She Cries. I like them all. I think they're all great songs. But yeah, there's just something about the album. It doesn't quite. The band doesn't feel as tight as the other 3, and so that's kind of why I put it at 4. Also, there's a lot of weirdness about who actually played the guitar solos. Beau Hill produced the record, and I think he sort of brought in outside players to replace parts. And there's a lot of debate that all the guitar solos were actually replaced. So Warrant didn't play any of the solos. But there is debates about that. It's really confusing because I wanted to cover some of these solos, and I'm having a hard time figuring out who actually played them. So yeah, that's my number 4. So my number 3, it's a little different than yours, but I'm gonna put Skid Row at 3. Um, I like Skid Row a lot. I'm a huge Skid Row fan, so definitely nothing against Skid Row. I actually prefer their next record a little more. It's called Slave to the Grind. Um, but this is a good album. Obviously, it's got the biggest hits out of any of these bands. Um, the album did big business. It was like 5 million. Did big business. So yeah, this was definitely the most successful of the 4. Uh, yeah, I mean, one thing I kind of have to add with these bands is, I think I might have said it in the intro, but it's unfortunate that they really didn't quite have enough time to really like give it a good go, because they just got killed by the 90s, right? I mean, they had like, it was like a 2 or 3 year window of being accepted as cool mainstream music, right? Like, because the 90s came
when Nirvana hit, it was over for these guys.
Like
the
like
whole
these guys
scene
were the first,
was done.
yeah. These guys were the first in line, right? They just got steamrolled, unfortunately, right? And but yeah, but they got in some they got in a few good records. But
right at the 11th hour, they snuck in a couple good ones.
yeah, they just barely got it in, right? Yeah, so my Skid Row's number 3. Okay, my number 2, I'm gonna go with Mr. Big. I would say that Mr. Big is the best band as far as playing goes of all 4 of them. I think they're the most talented guys. The bass player, Billy Sheehan, by far the greatest bass player probably in rock and roll. He's an unbelievable bass player. You probably heard all that bass shredding going on there. So yeah, crazy. And just Pat Torpey, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his last name there. He passed away, unfortunately, but he's such a solid drummer. I think Eric Martin could actually be my favorite singer of any of these singers. Maybe he's not as technically proficient at those high screams like Sebastian Bach is, but I mean, I think his voice is unbelievable. Paul Gilbert, serious guitar player, right? Serious shredder. And yeah, this album didn't have any hits on it, but I think all the songs are extremely competent. Had Enough is such a beautiful ballad. Um, yeah, such an amazing ballad. Addicted to That Rush, just a barn burner of an opener, right? Like just bass. So Billy Sheehan was the bass player for the David Lee Roth band, uh, and he would do that guitar shredding with Steve Vai in that David Lee Roth band. Um, so that's where he got his sort of big start. Um, and so yeah, he was doing this bass shredding like earlier, so he wanted to form his own band. But yeah, if you want to hear similar crazy pyro bass techniques playing, just go to David Lee Roth's like Eat 'Em and Smile. Some pretty impressive work on that record. Um, so yeah, that leaves my number one. I'm gonna go with Extreme. I'm a huge Extreme fan. I love Noodle Betancourt. Um, I love I love this record. I like the next one. I really love their third record. That's one of my favorite albums. Is Three Sides to Every Story. Um, but yeah, like Nuno he is an Eddie Van Halen, uh, protege for sure, but I'm fine with that. Um, he was a big deal as a guitar player. He definitely changed the game to a certain extent, just with his his like crazy sort of faux speed picking or his fake speed picking and his mutings. He had a lot of really amazing techniques that he brought to the guitar world, and yeah, this album, it's definitely so it's got Play With Me, which is confusing because it was not on all the albums, but that song was a huge song on Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So yeah, if you listen to that album with that song on it, really cool.
I have a confession to make, Jimmy. I saw that album. I saw that movie in the theater as a young man.
There you go. Yeah, probably the worst album cover though. I think it's a terrible album cover, but hey, I think it's a great album. Not their best, but it was definitely it made the industry perk up. Like they definitely got a second chance. And I say with Mr. Big, I mean it was definitely the band was so good that the label and the fans wanted more. Like even if it was a small fan group, the label definitely saw the potential in these two groups, and yeah, they were smart to give them a second chance. But
I think we can call a spade, Jimmy, and say all four of these album covers suck balls.
sure, yeah,
None of them were very good.
I'll go with that. The Mr. Big one is kind of fun a little bit. It's got the shoes.
This is so basic.
That's a terrible album cover.
Black and white. You can't even really see them.
You can't
the
even see
shitty script up top.
Yeah.
I never liked the Mr. Big one. I thought it was goofy would be the term I would use.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the very least, the Warrant album cover was was drawn.
Yeah.
Somebody took time to draw that, which was, there's some good artistic skills in the making of that cover, even though I hate it.
Yep.
Anyway.
So I guess if you gave them a ranking out of 10, that's I haven't done this, but let me see if I can do it here. So Warrant, I'm gonna have to say, like, in the genre that it's in, I would have to give Warrant a 7, because I think it's a good hair metal record for what it is. I think it works. 7. For Skid Row, I'd probably give it an 8, just because it was so successful, and so 8. Mr. Big, I'm going to tie Mr. Big and Extreme at 8.5.
Wow.
I think they're really good at what they are. But see, like, I have to put it in its genre, right? I mean, it sounds like a high rating compared to like Appetite for Destruction, but I think they're really good at what they are. I think I think the band is doing good work for what they are.
They're doing the business.
They are, yeah. Um, and yeah, and so yeah, like I was sort of stumbling to think of so yeah, the band I was stumbling to think of. So for me, if I'm gonna kind of show the like the history of hair metal, I'd say Van Halen were the godfathers, right? They were where it started. Um,
Rest in peace, Eddie.
yeah, yeah, and I think they were beyond hair metal, but like I think they influenced the genre with David Lee Roth doing his wild antics on stage and Eddie just being a guitar hero. I mean, I that spawned and just the whole idea of like rock and roll being a giant party, right? Like I think
The formula too, Jimmy. Super good looking front man.
Yeah.
Phenomenally good, talented lead guitar player. Very competent sticksman, and the bass keeping the groove in the background. Your Van Halen is the archetype, and they spawned the whole genre pretty much. The whole decade. Everybody that came after them owes them a debt. You're right.
Yeah, just like it's a giant party, it's fun. Yeah, and that formula, the good looking lead singer with his sidekick, you know, like like madman scientist guitar player, right? Doing crazy things that no one's seen before, right? Like that, yeah, that absolutely was the formula. And then it's kind of like the first wave after Van Halen. I'd say like Dokken was the band I was trying to think, like so Dokken, Motley Crue, and yeah, Rat. So for me, like those three bands are the first to come to mind of the first sort of early '80s bands that came in. And then yeah, I'd say probably Poison and Guns N' Roses were like the midpoint. But then yeah, there was a I'd say a massive wave after that of these guys where it was starting to get a little bit more like less theatrical, I'd say, and a little bit more like a little bit more stripped down. Like the productions weren't as 80s sounding. They were starting to sound a little bit bluesier, you know. You can kind of hear that in the Mr. Big recording, right? Like it's like Mr. Big, the Mr. Big album almost sounds like it's kind of in the 90s, like it's got its foot in the 90s. Um, and yeah, like a lot of these hair metal bands would become more bluesy, more even hard rocky, you know. Um, and then obviously when they hit the 90s, I think a lot of these bands were trying to be grungy. They were trying to jump on that grunge bandwagon, like I know Dokken did, Warrant did, Extreme.
Motley Crue very much did.
Motley Crue absolutely did. Yeah, yeah.
Motley Crue dove right into the pool head first.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's true. Because yeah, it's like, what else are you gonna do, right? I mean, you know, it's like sink or swim, right? But yeah, but these bands definitely squeezed in some some good work, and they managed to get some commercial success there, which is pretty impressive. But yeah, it was short lived. But yeah, I think all these bands are still going as far as I know. I'm not sure about Warrant, because Jenny Lane passed away.
No, they are Warrant. I think they just played Casino Niagara, like just a couple months ago.
Okay, so they're still going strong. Extreme just released a record a few months ago, and it was pretty big on the internet. You know, a lot of people were talking about it. And yeah, Mr. Biggs is always there too. And Skid Row, they're still going too.
I heard, Jimmy, can you tell me if this is true? I remember hearing that even though the 90s weren't good to these bands, like, you know, pre-Nirvana, big party, post-Nirvana, back to living in your mom's basement.
Yeah.
But Mr. Big actually went on to be successful in the 90s. And I remember hearing that in the year 2000 in Japan, I'm not sure if it was Tokyo or not, but they played a New Year's Eve Millennium gig to 75,000 people. They headlined to 75,000 people.
Wow.
Because they had a really, really big following in Japan. And so in terms of success, they never I don't think they ever had the same success as what they had with To Be With You in the States, because the States is a huge record buying population, but they never, they kept on coming out with records, and they're still really big in Japan, where they do quite well.
Yes, because that's where their original fan base started. So yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. Um, yeah, and I mean Paul Gilbert as well. Like, I mean, he's just such a recognizable name in the guitar community too, right? So I mean, I'm sure Paul Gilbert could go off and do a show and draw a huge crowd, just him doing his own solo thing too.
Paul Gilbert, Eddie Van Halen, Jimmy Wolf, all these names are interchangeable.
So yeah, that was good, Jeff. That was a fun one. Yeah, it's a guilty pleasure for me. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan of these records, but I put them on and I can't help but just have fun with it. Like they bring back memories for me, because I remember, you know, some of my friends had these albums, but it was going out a little bit, right? I mean, it'd be like, your friend's older brother that was 3 years older, like then you would have the CDs, right? I remember like one of my babysitters at that point had all these albums, right? Like, so
I can definitely agree with you. I remember all my friends' older brothers and sisters, like, so you know, my friends' older sisters, they liked Duran Duran and Rick Astley and all the pretty boys, and all their older brothers liked the rock. They liked the Motley Crue and Skid Row and Warrant and all that stuff. They all had long hair, and so definitely I knew that these records were cool, but it was out of my age bracket then. Um, but yeah, that's most definitely something I remember, is that all the older cool kids had these records, and you can't really deny like how big this scene was. Like, this scene, like, it took something like grunge to knock this scene off its pedestal, because there was, you and I really remember grunge because we were in high school then, but this was what it was like before. And you could definitely say, perhaps it wasn't exactly as similar with grunge, in that I don't think towards the end of that scene, it wasn't quite as formulaic as it got with the hair rock, because bands still wanted to be a little like distinct and original. But I mean, there's just no denying what kind of an impact rock music had in the 80s. It was a big deal, and again, it was so big it spawned, copies of copies of copies, and you had even. I do remember watching. It had to be like 10 years ago, but I saw a video for this band called the Bullet Boys, and they had a song called "Smooth Up In Ya," and it was awful. So I remember seeing this in the 90s. Now, so on our little break there, I went and looked it up. It actually came out in 1988, and I'm very surprised, because I thought it came out in 1992, like after Nirvana. And I remember thinking, man, that's strange. These guys just can't let it go. Man, these guys are so loyal to the formula, that even though Nirvana's the big deal now, they're like, no, hair metal's gonna keep going. Look, we got this now. But anyway, massive drums, massive guitar, massive lead vocal, huge Van Halen chorus, but so derivative, like "Smooth Up In Ya." Even the subject matter is so trite and but like I mean, I even caught myself. I watched the whole video, and I'm like, man, if I was a teenager in these days, I would have loved this. And even the video, like, it's shot on a big, huge sound stage. It's got like, spotlights. No one's wearing a shirt. The hair is massive. Everybody's dancing, and they're like having the time of their lives.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just, that is it's a prototypical example of formulaic carbon copy 80s hair metal. And also another funny story, I remember when I got my truck, it had satellite radio, so I would listen to like the hair rock stations, and they'd have people that would like call in and request things. And this one chick called in to, I'll never forget this, she called in to request that song. And she said, "Oh man, yeah, like I remember." She sounded like Mickey Rourke in The Wrestler when he said, "Yeah, like when." Do you remember? There's a scene in The Wrestler when Mickey Rourke and what's her face are in a bar there, some shithole bar, just drinking by themselves, and Rat comes on the radio, round and round, and he says, "Yeah, man, like they just don't make them like this anymore. Like what's wrong with having a good time? Like." Man, everything was so good till that pussy Cobain had to come and fuck everything up. and this chick, she said, like, when Bullet Boys came out, I was 15, and I was gonna marry the lead singer. He was so good looking, and they were my favorite. And she's like, "Oh man, I love all these guys. I love Warrant. I love Poison. I love, like this is the scene." And everything that came after it was just, this was the 80s was my day, and what came after, I'm not interested in at all. The 80s is where it was at. It was the best time of my life. And obviously this chick probably peaked in high school. And but these bands are well loved. And Warrant, like I said, they just did a show at Casino Rama or Casino Niagara or something like that, which is where the old bands go to play. But I mean, to even imagine that Warrant could still, even with the singer dead, they got a new singer. And I mean, I don't know if they've made any music anytime recently in the last 30 years, but the people still want to go see them. And I guess this scene still has some legs to it, because people are, I'm nostalgic about bands from my era. I'll always go see an older band. Fuck, I went to go see The Cure this year, Tears for Fears, and so it's different strokes for different folks. But it just goes to show that the Bullet Boys are smooth up in some people still.
Yeah, there is that rock and roll, that trend of the it's called the double entendre, right? Where it's like White Snake is notorious for double entendre like album titles, right? Like Ready and Willing, Come and Get It, Slide It In, Slip of the Tongue, Smooth Up In Ya, right? It's
yeah, and the double entendre too, as you're referencing it. It really was cheesy. There was no intellect behind it. Nothing, no romance, no, like these guys are talking about banging a chick in a dumpster behind the shit club that you're playing. That's what they're referring to in these songs. Not like, it's there's something seedy about all of it. And, like these guys want to bang you, and then they're for sure never going to call you. And although I guess that's every teenage boy's fantasy, now that I'm older, it seems a little silly to me. Yeah. And whereas at least, Guns N' Roses had It's So Easy, and Motley Crue had Girls, Girls, Girls. At least when these guys like GNR were, when they made Appetite, they weren't rich. I mean, these were struggling artists, but they were still living the life, and there were plenty of chicks, and it was easy. They They wanted for nothing. They were dead ass broke, sleeping in their rehearsal space, but they all had beautiful girlfriends and they were living the rock star life. And when Motley Crue did Girls, 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 they were really living the life. They had lots of money. They were touring the world and getting high all the time and buying cars and motorcycles. And so, the I guess the double entendre was it might have been kind of interesting for me as a young boy, being that they're talking about sex and stuff like that I didn't understand at that age. But now that I'm older, it just seems silly to me. It's cheap, and it's just tawdry and cheap, and whereas when I hear girls, 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 and it's so easy, they still ring true to me in that there is some substance behind it, and Smooth Opinion is just vapid to me. It's got nothing going on with the exception of, it's almost like the record label was like, all right, we're going to get the stylist from Poison to go suit you guys out, so you're going to go meet them. Then we're going to go film this video where Whitesnake filmed their last video, and we're going to get that producer that produced Rat's last album, and and also, funny enough, I watched this documentary on hair rock, and at Geffen Records there was they had some record executives. Obviously David Geffen ran the joint, but he hired good people to be A&Rs. So he had, I don't know how many were part of the record label, but there was 2 or 3 of them. It was a highly competitive atmosphere at Geffen Records to have the next big hit. And the one guy that signed GNR, Guns N' Roses knew they had something, and they weren't going to sell out for just. They wanted money and fame, but they also wanted 100% creative freedom to do whatever they wanted. So that wasn't really allowed in those days. The record label still wanted to have a hand in what they in the final product. But so GNR, they were being courted by all the record labels, and I mean all of them. So basically, Axl and Slash said, all we would do is we met with all of them, and we went for big fancy dinners, and we got them to buy us stuff, and they bought us drugs and booze and this and that, and he said, finally we held out for Geffen because they promised us everything we wanted, and that was ultimately we wanted 100% creative freedom to do what we wanted. And maybe the label had a hand in how the band was marketed, because that's the record label side of things. Maybe they chose what single to put out first or this and that. But the band got to record the songs as they wanted them to, and they were happy with the finished product, very much so. Whereas I remember in this documentary I watched, sorry, I'm getting a bit sidetracked, but in this documentary, the other A&R guy at Geffen Records thought, well, you know what? Fuck, if he found GNR, I can find somebody. He was a Deep Purple fan. He liked David Coverdale. He was already a fan, and he had a meeting with him and said, look, I've got an idea. I want to make you Guns N' Roses. And Coverdale was like, man, you know what? Like, I already got a thing with Deep Purple here. I don't want to really, I'm happy doing what I'm doing. And he said, don't you want to be like look at all the money they have. Don't you want to be filthy rich? And don't you want to be number one and this and that? Like, he says, I can give that to you. And so reluctantly Coverdale agreed. And the first thing that the A&R said is, he said, all I did is Poison had a huge video at the time. I found out who their stylist was, and I just hired them, and I outfitted Whitesnake. And there you go. Debut, or whatever album was the big one for them. We made that album, massive success. And although in the grand scheme of things, GNR had the bigger success with Appetite, he's like, he's like, I think we followed that up pretty good with Whitesnake. It was a massively successful, and he said we had the two biggest bands in the genre, arguably, on Geffen Records, and he said no one else could do that. Every label would be scrambling to find one, and he said we had two. So there you go. And again, when you look at those Whitesnake videos, I mean, and even that Bullet Boys video, like they look like Poison, Motley Crue, and Whitesnake. I mean, they got ripped jeans. Again, no one wearing a shirt, massive hair. Everybody's just fucking dancing and moving all over the place and theatrical and throwing drumsticks in the air and big huge kit. Way more drums in that kit than he's playing. By the way, I don't know if you saw that in the video for Smooth Up In You too, but he's got this. There's got to be fucking 15 drums in this kit, and he's really only playing a couple of them. Yeah. But it's like it's just in that era, everything was bigger and better, bigger, more huge, more elaborate, more money.
Yeah.
And that A&R guy, I remember him saying too. He said it was just the day. It was the day and age when really you needed to spend a lot of money to make a lot of money, and that's also how that kind of made Duran Duran a big thing too. Like they spent a lot of money in their music videos, and it let everybody believe that they were this big jet-setting band that was, they filmed Rio or Hungry Like the Wolf, I think was filmed in Sri Lanka. And they're like, well, okay, we've got this idea. We're going to make this video on a yacht and you guys are just going to be running around. And what band wouldn't like that? Just you can go around, chase these supermodels and hunt tail on your off hours while you're not filming. And then we're going to fly in the middle of the ocean, film on this yacht for a little bit. And, it certainly was, it was different from what happened afterwards when less was more, because grunge kind of brought the mood down. The songs were dark and deep and introspective. These guys weren't recording in top-notch studios. It was definitely a scaled down thing. And mind you, I guess as that scene progressed, they probably were recording in better facilities, but it's just like everybody in the 80s wanted to record in the best studio, and they wanted the best producer, and they needed the best stylist, and they wanted the best catering on their video shoots, and everything was bigger and bigger and better. And
yeah, and it was still connected to that original rock and roll ethos that kind of happened in the late 60s, early 70s. And you could say like even prior to Van Halen, it was Led Zeppelin and these guys, right? Where, the long hair of the hippie era, right? Where like that was a badge that you're an outcast, like a rebel, a rock and roll rebel of society. You'd have long hair.
You're not straight laced like your parents.
Yeah, exactly. With the suit and tie, the short hair. So like the long hair was like, yeah, it was kind of it was from that era where that was a sign of rebellion. That's a whole topic there of like hair, of like how different hairstyles would determine your status in society, right? But I
also think it's funny, Jimmy, how if we're going to talk about hair, how so in like the 70s, all those guys had just big hair, right? And then, in the 80s, like Van Halen all had big hair too. But, it got a little more, there was styling involved. Like Michael Anthony didn't have really, really long hair. And Alex also kept his hair a bit more on the tame side. But it was longer, but he went to a barber and had his hair dealt with. And then in the late 80s, it was just the more hair you had, the better. And let's make it even bigger. Let's spray it all up and get it huge, like Axl in Appetite, where it's just spray painted to death. It's like his hair is up like this.
Yeah.
And then in the grunge scene, all those guys had long hair too, like Alice in Chains, uh, and Soundgarden and Nirvana, but it was all like greasy long hair, and like those guys didn't shower often, and almost it was I'm not gonna. It was almost like the difference was where in the 80s these guys had like stylists that went with them, and they got preened up before every show, and they did stuff to their hair to make it big for the performance. Nirvana looked like, when they filmed Teen Spirit, that they probably just played a jam at some shit bar the night before. Yeah. So their hair is greasy because they were probably up all night drinking and they're hungover and they didn't have time to shower. Yeah. And, like Lane or Jerry Cantrell from Alice in Chains too, like long, stringy, greasy, long hair. Like that seemed to be the look for that scene. Still long hair, just kind of greasy and unkempt. And
well, you can
the long hair.
Like punk rock was the first sort of blip in the rock and roll timeline where I think grunge kind of like connected with, where a lot of the punk rockers would have short hair, and they were rebelling against the big stadium rock and roll guys by being stripped down, like short hair. And I think that's where the grunge era got a lot of their influences was like from the punk era, where it's like we're kind of the anti-rock star, where it's funny because it's like long hair was counterculture back in the late 60s, but then it became the established mainstream look in the 80s, right? So then cutting your hair was the rebellious thing to do. So then all these hair metal bands started to cut their hair, and it was just like it was just a thing that you saw throughout the 90s. And it was for me, the most shocking thing was seeing Metallica with short hair, right? That was a big, oh wow, Metallica cut.
All of them cut their hair at the same time. Like they
all cut their hair. Yeah,
they all had long hair, and then they all had short hair. It was, and you know what? You're really right about that too, because when Metallica did the Black Album, like they still looked like, rough 80s rockers, like, scruffy beards, long hair. And then, 95 comes, they got jean jackets. They're I can't remember whether they had facial hair, but they looked like they looked better put together. Like, and I don't think Metallica ever had stylists, but they at least looked like they're going to move with the times, and they looked better to me. Like, whereas in the Sandman video, like they got black t-shirts. It seemed to me like black jeans, black t-shirts, and leather jackets. That was what they wore. And then they started looking better. And I'm not going to say they were more fashionable per se, but someone styled their hair. You know what I mean? Like they got a haircut, and it looked good. They just looked better to me. They looked more put together, and that was in the early 90s was when I started to care about my appearance. Before high school, I could care less, but then there's girls in high school, and you got to start doing what you can to you want to have a hairstyle, and you want to look different. You want to differentiate yourself from other people, and you want to have a style and something that you can identify with. And I just think Metallica were probably a little tired of that look, that scene, and they distanced themselves. And I gotta say, much to their chagrin, it didn't really work well for them. I mean, I can't say I'm probably the only guy that likes 90s Metallica. I don't really think most of their true fans, I think, would call that the worst era of their career. But I mean, I thought Load was a really good record, and Reload was pretty good too. And the Black Album, I think, is the best album they ever did. But that's just my humble opinion.
I agree that the Black Album's great. I'm not a Load guy. I think it's a load of shit, to be honest with you, but I don't know. Well,
did you like I Disappear?
That was for the Mission Impossible 2 soundtrack, right?
Yeah. Did you
That's
like
the
that?
one. That's the one song that I do like. Yeah, like that is pretty cool. I mean, if we're on the topic of Metallica, like the one thing that I kind of annoyed me with Metallica was their whole thing was they didn't want to be part of that whole glam metal thing that that kind of was an LA thing, right? They were about just they still had the long hair and the rock and roll thing, but it was about not wearing makeup, not being all dolled up in costumes, right? It was just about being like having sneakers on and jeans. Like that was their whole thing, and that was their whole ethos of their image for up until the Black Album. But then for the Load albums, they started wearing makeup. They wore a lot of eyeliner and like it just seemed like it seemed like a bit of a betrayal of what they were doing. They were trying to fit into what was popular at the time, and just like for me it just went against their original ethos of being just regular people. And it's like, yeah, it's like when they're
You felt betrayed, Jimmy. You felt betrayed.
well, it really kind of felt like they were selling out, right? Like there are these, like Lars is this, like they're all like these millionaires selling fine art and wearing makeup, and it's just weird. Like that's not the Metallica brand that I was. So I mean, maybe it's just a branding thing. It's like, well, who is Metallica? What is Metallica? I think brand is important, and if we're circling back to our topic of these '80s, kind of hair metal bands, like for me, it's like, yeah, it's like, what is the brand? It's this fun party, kind of rebellious with the long hair. We're from the old school of rock, where our heroes are Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, and we're just continuing that tradition of rebellious, fun rock and roll where it's a party, it's women, it's just fun. Like for me, that's the brand of hair metal, and it's fine. Metallica was not that. It was like, and that's what made them so special, was that they weren't that, but they were kind of going along the whole time with that trend, but they were outside of that trend doing their own thing that was a lot more serious, right? But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I kind of miss that, just that fun, like when I look at, I mean, this is us obviously getting older and talking about the good old days, but like when I see these indie bands, it's like everyone's got short hair, they're all dressed plainly, they all kind of look like they all have a serious look on their faces, like it just looks like they're not, like, it's like, where's the fun, right? Like everything has to be so serious, and I miss that in rock and roll. Like I miss that silliness, that where it's like they're kind of being cool, but they're doing it like with like a bit of a wink. Like they're, like I'm sure the Bullet Boys think they're being trendy, but they're kind of winking. It's like, this is really silly. Like we look ridiculous with like shirtless with giant hair. Like it looks pretty silly, right? But they kind of know that, and I don't know. I miss that about the hair metal thing. Like I miss that the whole thing was kind of making fun of itself the entire time. I don't know.
I definitely agree with you with the with bands nowadays. Or nobody. Not only is nobody having any fun, but there's no personalities. Like, and these guys in these bands were, like they had stuff to say, and David Lee Roth never had anything to say on world politics, but everything he had to say was entertaining.
Yeah,
like,
totally. Yeah,
the kind of guy you want to see in an interview. Do I want to watch, Interpol give an interview? Absolutely not. Do I care what Mumford and Sons have to say? I couldn't give a fuck less, to be honest.
Well, yeah, and if like David Lee Roth like walked into, like, say he walked into a convenience store, I mean, you would turn your head, right? I mean, like he looks different. He looks like a superhero or something. Whereas like, if one of the guys from the Black Keys walks into like a laundromat, like you wouldn't really look twice. I mean, you'd look because they're famous, but just like the way they're just dressed like ordinary people. But maybe that's the thing. Like, maybe that is a counterculture thing, but I feel like that isn't the counterculture. That is the mainstream to look normal. And I kind of miss, yeah, it's like if you're a rock star, it's like you're like a musical superhero. You look different. You're like, I don't know, maybe that's the whole thing with drugs. Like you're on drugs and you have superpowers because you're on drugs. You can perform more than the average person. You can do things on stage that the ordinary person wouldn't do. Your hair is longer than normal.
I think music is definitely suffering from a lack of fun.
Yeah, lack of fun. Yeah,
And I don't mind when a band is successful to embrace that a little bit.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a fine line though. I mean, I think you need, like, Motley Crue embraced it wholeheartedly, but there was some serious, there was a serious side to them too. Like Dr. Feelgood doesn't end well for Rat Tail Jimmy. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I heard he's going down.
Yeah.
So, and also Guns N' Roses, like My Michelle, and Mr. Brownstone, like these are songs that maybe kind of, they're seedy and they talk about the underbelly of society, but they're not necessarily glamour. Like Your Daddy Works in Porno, and they're not glamorizing it. They're addressing it, I guess I would say, or bringing it to light.
Yeah.
And like I gotta say, even Oasis had plenty of celebratory songs, and a lot of, like, on their debut there was Cigarettes and Alcohol, which is talking about the party, and you might as well do the White Line, and then you had also songs that were more serious in nature, like Slide Away, and how about Rock and Roll Star? The first song on their debut is actually telling you where they want to go. They're like, tonight we're the Rock and Roll Stars. Yeah. So buckle up, you're in for a fun ride. And it's a fun riff. There's nothing melancholy in that song. But for me, I like my music to be more, I can't take a 24-hour party anymore on an album. I want a range of emotions because that's, well, for one, the party is done for me. But
me too, Jeff. Me too.
It's just, I'd like something that's a little more whole and well-rounded, and I think all of the best bands and best albums do that, even though that era seemed to just side way too much on the party. Like Quiet Riot, I heard, and maybe Quiet you could shed some light on this.
Yeah.
I heard that the singer for Quiet Riot, like, that guy could never, ever let the party go. Like, that guy died penniless, and he was living in his mom's basement. Like, and no joke, he actually was living in his mom's basement when he died. And, like, he just couldn't give it up. Like, the party never ended for that guy. The party started in 1984 with Mental Health and kept going, with worse and worse results until he died in the 2010s, I think.
Yeah,
Kevin Cadigan or something.
2007. Yeah, so Kevin DeBro.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so Quiet Riot was actually a huge like early hair metal band. Yeah, like 80, so it was like 1983. That's when Mental Health came out. That album was huge. Yeah, it sold it was 6 times platinum in the States. Wow. Yeah, it's a big album.
Big seller.
Yeah, big seller. And even like Ozzy Osbourne, right? Like he was a big proponent of that early 80s scene too. Yeah. Okay, Jeff, I gotta wrap it up here, but yeah, that was fun.
We definitely went on a bit of a tangent tonight.
Which is fine, man. It was a fun tangent.
It was a fun tangent, and excellent choice on this week's subject matter, Mr. Wolf.